Thank you very much. Today, I want you to think about is language. I want you to think about meanings, intentions, and language structure. Something we don't normally think about. It's like the air we breathe, or it's like riding a bicycle. We tend just to do it. We don't really think about it. We spend 80% of our day communication activities, so it's something that we need to think about. Language, in part, has become what is sensible, what seems sensible to us, or what we've learned, or what we have assumed. We don't normally think about it. What we tend to think about language is we tend to think that words have a single reliable meaning that everybody understands, that language is not political, that language is unchanging, and that words cannot harm us. Well, as researchers and as individuals, we know these things are not true. Researchers are particularly concerned with language because they've located a bias in language. They've located a bias both in syntax and semantics. That is, both in sentence structure and in meanings of words. So just like fish notice water or birds don't notice the air that they're flying in, we don't notice that there's a bias in language. Two frameworks or ideas that I want you to think about today are that language shapes our thoughts about reality and truth, and the opposite, that our thoughts about reality and truth shape our language. The first instance that I told you about is the idea that because we have certain words for things, that it tends to influence, shape our thoughts about it. So an example would be to illustrate that the Eskimos have 27 words for the word snow. So because they have this vocabulary for snow, they tend to think in very distinct ways about snow that we don't think about because we have a limited vocabulary about snow. A number of years ago, we didn't have a word for sexual harassment, and it was very difficult for us to think about sexual harassment, about it being a reality or a truth. We didn't have a word for sexist language, but since we have created that, we tend to think about those items very seriously. The opposite is that our thoughts, our creations, our observations about a truth or reality tend to influence and shape our language. So in other words, about 20 years ago, we didn't have the computer industry, and today we do, so that we have created a language for that. 20 years ago, we didn't have words for boot up, software, hardware, RAM, CD-ROM, but today we do because we need that. We have new inventions. The next thing I'd like to talk about is sexism in language. And I have a sentence on the screen that I want you to direct your attention to and see if you can identify the features of the bias that is in language. The sentence reads, Mrs. Gregory Bateson was a pioneer in the field of anthropology and a hero to many of her freshman students. Mrs. Gregory Bateson. Who is Mrs. Gregory Bateson? Okay. Mrs. Gregory Bateson is Margaret Mead. The reason you don't know that it's Margaret Mead is because we've chosen the traditional choice here for naming. This is the traditional choice of naming, and it is one option that women have for naming themselves after they get married. This particular choice produces an invisible and a non-identity for women. And frequently, women's statuses still are dependent upon their husbands' careers. Another feature of this sentence is the word pioneer. When we think of pioneer, we think of history, think of historical moments. I'd like you to look at this hominid evolution chart that I have on the screen and notice that we all evolved from a chimpanzee to a standing up person and to a middle-class white European male. Interestingly enough, I don't identify myself as such. And with historical terms, with evolution of man, caveman, frontiersman, father of our country, with this language, we tend to think about history being made by men and only men. In fact, stories that are historical are primarily about men's experiences of the world. They're largely a record about battles or alliances. They're stories about warfare or conquest. Women's experiences are largely left out or tacked on to, quote, real history. History has been delineated in periods such as war by war or by presidential administration to presidential administration, and women's experiences have been largely left out or just tacked on. So what we get is that in World War II, women were nurses or they were working in the factory as Rosie the Riveter, but they were not an integral part. And in fact, what current historians are focusing on is the integral part that women had in history, not that they were just added on. Another feature of history is genealogy. And I want you to look at the screen and look at tracing our ancestors. Of our fathers, we know some distinction. We know that he was a soldier, he was a sailor, he was a carpenter, or he held some particular office. Of our mothers, what do we know of our mothers? We know that she may have been beautiful, she had curly hair, she may have been kissed by an actor, famous person. We know nothing about her except her name, the dates of marriage, and the number of children that she had. Women seem to be, in genealogy, an appendage. They seem to be something that's added on. We only trace our fathers' names. We don't trace the mothers' names. So as you can see on the chart that's on the screen, that if we were to trace the lineage of our mothers, we would be tracing their father's name. Hero is the next word that I want to draw your attention to. This is an example of the female version of the word depending upon the male version. Hero is the male version, heroine is the female version. There are over 200 pairs of this example. Host, hostess, actor, actress, male, female are just a part of those 200 pairs, where the masculine is the base and the feminine is the suffix or the prefix that is added on to it. So we get the idea that the male version is the essential important part and the female version is the added on part. The last word that I want us to think about is the word freshman. And this is an example of the case of the generic he, the case of the generic he or the generic man. And that is he that stands for he's and she's, and man that stands for all people. So we get words in addition to freshman like man-made, penmanship, goodwill to men, sportsmanship, one small step for man, one giant step for mankind. One test for sexism in language is if the reverse were true, we wouldn't have sexism. If we had woman-made, goodwill to women, sportswomanship, one small step for woman, one giant step for womankind, we would know that it does not include everyone. If we hold with the generic he, we get sentences such as, man has difficulty in giving birth. I bet he does have difficulty in giving birth. When we come to a sentence with a generic he in it, when men read that sentence, they know they're automatically included in that sentence. They don't have to think about it. When women come to a sentence with a he or man in it, it's ambiguous. Are they included in the sentence or are they excluded in the sentence? It's not clear to them. So they're caught in this linguistic contradiction. They're man and not man at the same time, and it's problematic. More importantly, we find evidence of the generic he and man used in children's books, in textbooks, in the judicial and medical systems, in broadcast medium, radio, TV, movies, and basically the world is male unless proven otherwise. When we use the generic he, men and women both visualize males, and more importantly, think about males, and the primacy of males is supported, which affects women in relation to career choices and to self-esteem, which can be very deleterious. So features of this sentence that we've talked about, the naming, the women's traditional naming, the historical aspects of the words, the female version based on the male version, and the case of the generic he and man, all these are examples of words that describe women are dependent upon the male version. So in language, embedded in language, we have the idea that women are not independent creatures. They are dependent in grammatical structure. They're dependent upon the male version. So this is an important assertion that this sentence illustrates. Our second sentence is Former President Kennedy and First Lady Jacqueline Bouvier, patron of the arts, rarely skied at Jackson Hole, Wyoming. The first thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the order of terms. We have President Kennedy and First Lady Jacqueline. This is an example of how we speak and how we write. We speak in this particular order: man, woman, husband, wife, brother, sister. And the reason we do this is because this order was prescribed in the 15th century in order to honor the worthier party. So it was prescribed that we order this male, female. It was thought of to be more natural. So it's very hard for us to reverse that, and it seems unnatural almost for us to do that. But I encourage you to do that in your writing and in your speaking. The second feature of this sentence is the term First Lady. This is an example of words that do not have equivalent. When we have a female president, what will we call her husband? The first man? We don't have a word for it. Likewise, we don't have an equivalent for master bedroom, for grandfatherly advice, for grandfathered in, for bachelor and master's degree. The third feature is the asymmetrical term, patron of the arts. The symmetrical term, or the equivalent term, supposedly equivalent term, is matron. Well, she's not a matron of the arts, and matron has a whole other connotation. Bachelor, spinster, matron, patron, grandfatherly advice, wives' tale, are all supposed to be equal, but are nowhere near equal. If you were a single person, which would you rather be, a bachelor or a spinster? I know which one I'd rather be. The last feature that I want you to think about in this sentence is the eponym, Jackson Hole. Male eponyms are words like Bartlett Pear, Ferris Wheel, Franklin Stove, Mason Jar, and places such as Pikes Peak and Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And we have institutions such as P.T. Barnum and L.L. Bean. For females, female eponyms, we have Bloomers, Mae West Jacket, we have Grand Tetons, and we have Nipple Mountain, Colorado. And my guess is that they haven't been named by a woman, but they were named by a man for particular features that he happened to appreciate about women. Interestingly enough, there are over 1,000 words that are derogatory for women, and nowhere near that for men. I have come across a poem that I would like to read to you that I have entitled "The Birdification of Women," that illustrates the derogatory terms for women. And this is about birds that tell about women's lives. And interestingly enough, in England, an informal expression for a woman is a bird. When she's young, she's called a chick. When she marries, she starts nesting or feathers her nest. Soon, she may feel cooped up and may fly the coop. She may get a job where she works for wages which are considered chicken feed because she's thought of as a bird brain. Or she may chicken out of the market and go to hen parties where she cackles with friends while watching over her brood. She begins to henpeck her husband or egg her husband on. Finally, all the children leave home and she has empty nest syndrome. In old age, she's considered an old biddy and may crack up. Isn't it foul? So the order of terms that we have in this sentence, the words that don't have an equivalent, the asymmetrical terms, and the eponyms, all lead us to the conclusion that there are more positive words in the English language for men than there are for women. Back to our framework, if there are more positive words for men, it leads us to think more positively about men and less about women. There aren't that many words. The third sentence that I have on the screen is the old master scientist had an easy time hatching a chick in his incubator. Let's look at this more carefully. Old master is an example of a word that has a parallel. What is the parallel for old master? Old mistress? Parallel terms such as sir, madam, master, mistress, call boy, call girl have very different connotations depending on which side of the equation you happen to be on. So madam, mistress, call girl all have negative sexual connotations. They are not the equivalent to sir, master, cowboy. So men are valued and praised for their physical strength and their sexual accomplishments. Females are still valued and judged primarily on their physical attractiveness and sexiness, and they are denigrated for it. So the continuation of the double standard lives on. Women are linguistically punished for having sexual thoughts, sexual actions, and sexual impulses. The second feature that I want you to look at in this sentence is the word chick. Not only is it a young chicken, it is slang for women. We have many more derogatory terms for women than we do for men. Words such as broad, chick, babe, girl, and many, many more. For men, we have a few, and they're more complimentary. Stud, jock, dude. We don't have near the number of sexually derogatory words for men than we do for women. The last word I want you to look at in this particular sentence is the word easy. And there's no reason why you would have particularly chosen that as a sexist term, but I'll show you why. It is an example of a neutral term. If I say, it's easy, you think of a particular job that's easy, a particular thing that's facile to do. When I say, he's easy, we're thinking about college classes. We're thinking about a particular professor that might be an easy grader, or he gives easy final exams, or he's an easy A. When I say she's easy, we have a sexual connotation. The same holds true for other neutral words such as hot, loose, and professional. When we attach them to a gender, specifically the female gender, we have a negative sexual connotation. So language acquires a meaning when we attach it to a particular gender. It's interesting to note that there are no positive words in the English language for women's sexuality or for a strong female. And since there are no words, we tend not to think about those as being a part of reality. Another facet that is important to note is in words like master, mistress, that there are many other meanings for the word master. Just think about it. We have mastering a skill, we have a master copy, we have master tape, or a recording master. And there are many other uses that we use daily for master. Well, this increases the positive connotations for the word master, or for that particular equivalent. While the linguistic equal, mistress, shares none of these positive interpretations that we have for master. Likewise, other words that fit in this category are words that we use all the time, like fellow, as in fellow research. We have a fellowship. We have a research fellow that is coming into the graduate program. Words like grandfathered in or pioneer, where we're pioneering a path. These are all terms that we use not only for history or historical means, but we use in other contexts that just accentuate the positiveness of the master. So the sexual connotations for neutral words, the slang for women, the parallel terms that are sexually marked, all lead us to the conclusion that words are much more sexually weighted for women, and they're primarily negative sexual connotations. The fourth sentence that I want you to draw your attention to is, Marion was a shrewd courtier in the royal entourage of Louis XIV. We have words such as courtier, which is a sovereign companion. The female equivalent is courtesan, which is a high-class hooker. Words such as gentleman, sir, Mr., courtier, master, bachelor have not gone through the same pejorative shift that lady, madam, courtesan, mistress, and spinster have gone through. We just don't have that same semantic derogation. Another word in this sentence is shrewd. Even though etymologically the word shrewd does not come from shrew, we are much more apt to find the word shrewd in connection with a male business partner or a male professional who has passed a shrewd deal. We are much more likely to find the word shrew in connection with a female. Two different connotations. So words that are associated with females have a very different connotation than males. We have the word dog. If a male is described of as a dog, oh, you dog, okay? He's really pulled off something cleverly, or he's really aced a final, where he's really done something very skillful. If a woman is a dog, it's not someone you want to take out on a date. The word hussy originally meant housewife. It was just a mere abbreviation for housewife. The word whore originally meant lover of either sex. The word tart, dolly, or kitty were originally terms of endearment. The word slut, interesting enough, was a male who neglected his appearance. Okay, all of these words have changed, and they have changed to attach themselves to the female context and to the semantic derogation of that. The next word that I'd like to think about, and it's a name, is the name Marion. Names like Beverly, Francis, Marion, and Shirley originally named male children. Gradually, parents started naming their female children after these names, and they were both accepted as male names and female names. And then they were primarily taken over as female names. Well, they never went back to being male names. They're thought of as sissy names. Another example of this semantic derogation is in the case of the Army, or in the case of the Marine Corps. When men join the Army, we can't have them doing female jobs. But in fact, what they do is female jobs. So we can't have the men of the Army being nurses. We have to have them being medics or corpsmen. We can't have them being secretaries. They have to be clerks or typists. We can't have them being dishwashers. We have to have them being KP or kitchen police. They don't have the same connotation. So words that are associated with female over time become debased or have a negative connotation, or they become devalued. The same thing does not happen for males. I think it's worth elaborating on this. We need to ask, why is it so important for our culture to think this negatively about women? In general, linguists agree that if there's an elaborated vocabulary on a certain topic, it is of a particular concern to society as a whole. And the semantic rule seems to be that words that are associated with females need to be trivial, devalued, and inferior. Language tells us about the hierarchical structure of the relationship between men and women, and it serves to construct a division between them. Men are in the foreground and women are in the background, or invisible. And somehow, although it's not so much important as to how or why, somehow at some point in history we invented sexism in language, and it became embedded into the language. The arbitrary category of male as norm and female as deviant are constructed. Once these categories are constructed, it is very difficult to root them out, and we begin to organize our world within those categories. So new observations, new data, or information that emerges is embedded into those categories, or just fit right into those categories, because it's easier. Since we have these words, these negative words about women, it is easier to talk about women in those ways. And therefore, it is easier to think about women in those ways, which becomes a reality and truth of sorts. And this perpetuates the sexist attitudes, and it just further inscribes it in our culture and inhibits change. And the real tragedy is that women are more likely to see themselves as negative, trivial, and inferior. So the main features, the main characteristics of our language that we've talked about today are that linguistically the women's words are dependent upon the male version. She is not linguistically independent. There are more positive words for males than for females. There are sexually weighted terms for females that are negative, and the terms that are associated with women go through a semantic derogation. What can we do about this? Well, we've already done some things, and some things are already taking place. We have the idea of gender-neutral occupational categories, where we don't call someone a mailman, we call someone a mail carrier. We don't call someone a chairman, we call someone a chairperson or a chair. We don't call someone a fireman, we call someone a firefighter. We don't address our letters "Dear Sir" anymore, we address them "Dear Colleague," "Dear Committee Member," "Dear Reader." And we don't name our hurricanes only female names. We name them males and female names. Share that. Another thing people are doing is they're speaking up about sexist use of language, both in classes and in everyday life, and definitely need a continuation of doing that. We can change the meanings of words. We can recycle them. There are all sorts of dictionaries that are giving alternatives that we can use as resources to change the words of meanings, to recycle them to a different meaning. The other thing we can do is we can change the terms to describe a situation. So we can create a new language. As we have talked about today, language has an inhibiting feature where it basically handicaps us into thinking about people in different ways. It likewise has a creative feature where we can create a new language for these thoughts that we have. So instead of talking about a mother or a child care worker, we can say that that person is involved in human development. Or instead of talking about someone doing housework, they're doing organizational administration or household administration. It's much more punch to it. And in fact, you learn many, many tasks in running a household that are extremely comparable to a CEO. Financial budgeting, management, many things are very comparable. So we need to sensitize ourselves to the bias in language and take responsibility for our use of that bias in language. Take responsibility for not using sexist or biased language. The second thing we need to do is to sensitize others around us. My guess is your life is very similar to mine, and many people that are around me in my everyday life use sexist language. So we need to sensitize them to their use of sexist language. And we can do that in a humorous way. We don't have to do it in a very admonishing way. And the third thing that we need to know and believe very firmly is that when people use sexist language, or when they use this demeaning language, that it is not a deliberate, malicious attempt to devalue or denigrate or demean the person. It is the language that we have all been born into. It is a part of the fixtures. When we are born, this is what we're given. And it is our responsibility to change it. It is our responsibility to create new meanings, new words to describe the positive thoughts that we have about women today. To go back to our original frameworks or ideas that language influences and shapes our thoughts about truth and reality, it influences our thoughts about truth and reality about women and men. And our thoughts about truth and reality about women and men influence our language. It is not that it is one or the other. It is both that language and thoughts accentuate specific elements of men and women that we notice and that are further inscribed in our language and that are recreated in our social life. Sexism is embedded in our language, and it tends to have us think about women in more derogatory ways, and it tends to have us think about men in much more generally positive ways. Sexism in language relates to power and value differences, not biological or sexual differences. A lot of the researchers would have you believe that this is embedded in our biology. It is not. It relates to power and value differences. It is a dialectical process. We must do both simultaneously. We must change the language and change our thoughts about men and women and our truth that we have about men and women, that we have learned. We have it that they're very different. We are more alike than we are unalike. I'll say that again because it's really important. We are more alike than we are unalike. There are many ways to empower ourselves through language, and our language can serve to influence positive change in our thoughts about women. Thank you.